in Somerville, Massachusetts, with his wife, Federica, and their two dogs, Nomi and Golda. And with that, I will hand it over to Mishy.
Well, thank you so much, Amy, and thank you all for being here today and for taking the time to join this Zoom event. And it's a real pleasure, and I hope that before too long we'll be able to do such events in person and that I'll be able to meet many of you. So what we're going to do today, what I wanted to talk about was as Amy very generously said, I am the co-founder and host of Israel Story, which is Israel's leading podcast and the largest Jewish podcast in the world. And what I want to do today is tell you a little bit about how that came to be. It was an unlikely journey, and play you some clips from the show. So we're going to hear some brief audio clips from the show, which hopefully will whet your appetite. And if you're not already a Israel Story listener, I very much hope that you will become one by the end of this hour. And also to consider the larger question of why and if storytelling is a useful prism through which to engage with Israel, and how you even go about telling a story of a country, and at that particularly a complicated, multifaceted country like Israel. So as Amy said, my name is Mishy. I was born and raised in Jerusalem, and went to the army. I was in the army for 3 years, like many other Israelis. And after the army, I came here to the States to do my undergrad at Harvard, and studied history, and then studied archaeology, as Amy said, in England, and came back here to teach for a few years. And then I reached a moment in life where I didn't really know what to do next. I was interested in many different things in life, and I had concurrent applications out to be a soccer coach in Northern Ireland, and a Mossad agent, and a bunch of PhD applications. And I didn't really know what to do. And my father gave me a piece of wise advice, which was that if you don't know what to do in life, just stay on the path that you're already on. And the path that I had been on for quite some time at that point had been this academic path in university. So I said to myself, okay, well, you know, I'll go back home to Israel and start a PhD. I felt that I had lived abroad for a long time by that point. It was time to come back to Israel and meet a nice Jewish girl and settle down. Of course, to my mom's dismay, and unbeknownst to her, what actually happened was that shortly after I came back to Israel, I met one of the sole Catholic girls in town, who is now my wife, Federica from Italy. But anyway, just before coming back to Israel after 7 years of living abroad, I decided to mark the end of this era in the States by buying a 2000 Ford Focus station wagon and packing all of my belongings into it, including my dog Nomi, and going, in the words of Simon and Garfunkel, to search for America. So I left Cambridge, Massachusetts, and for 3.5 months traveled something like 13,000 miles through 34 states, up and down and east and west, including Orange County, and ended up many months and countless experiences later in San Francisco, where this trip came to an end. During this trip, I met, you know, in America that I would never have otherwise experienced. I slept in trailer parks in Pittsburgh, and in all kinds of small villages in the Ozarks, and and seaside mansions in Santa Barbara. It was really tremendously interesting. If I have one piece of advice, by the way, that you might want to take from this talk, is that if you ever decide to embark on such a trip yourselves, take a dog, because a dog is an unbelievable breaker of social barriers. So if you think about it, it's completely acceptable to go up to a stranger and start petting their dog and engage in conversation with them. But if you eliminate the dog from the equation, it somehow becomes unacceptable, or even creepy or something like that. But a dog allows you to start talking to people and chatting and hearing stories. And that was my experience during this road trip. And prior to embarking on this road trip, my best friend Ro'i, who had been my best friend for many, many years at that point, since we were in 3rd grade, said, listen, Mishy, you're going to be spending a tremendous amount of time in the car. So why don't I download something called a podcast to your phone? Now, this was 2010. I had never heard of a podcast before. I don't know how many of you are podcast listeners, but hopefully many. I said to him, okay, that sounds fine. I had just purchased my very first smartphone, and he downloaded something like 200 episodes of This American Life, which I imagine most of you are aware of or listen to or know about. You can nod if that is the case. Okay, a whole bunch of nods there. And This American Life is sort of the podcast, which really birthed this movement of podcasts. And what it is essentially is, in a way, kind of a throwback to what radio was 2 generations ago, of very carefully crafted stories and investigative journalism pieces and human interest stories in audio form. Almost like a documentary film, but just without the visual element. And Ro'i had downloaded, as I said, I think 200 or 300 episodes of This American Life to my phone. And I sort of relegated that to the back of my mind and forgot about it. And instead, I was listening to books on tape, and I was listening to music, and I was listening to, at some point I reached the Bible Belt, and I started tuning into evangelical Christian radio stations, which were so fascinating to me because I had never really heard anything like that beforehand. And I sort of couldn't get enough of those talk radio shows. And then after a few days of listening to that, a few days straight of listening to that, I realized that they essentially circled through 2 or 3 topics. So it was like, Merv, the news coming out of the Capitol this week can point to one of 3 conclusions. Barack Obama is either the devil, the Antichrist, or a Muslim. And now let's go to our correspondent Yossi in Jerusalem. Tell us once again about the Jews in the Holy Land. I found it very fascinating, but at some point I had enough of sort of the same messages being hammered again and again. And I said, I was outside of Vicksburg, Mississippi. And I said to myself, okay, well, let's try Ro'i's podcast. And I listened to my very first podcast episode, and I didn't realize that at the time, but this was a moment that changed my whole life and really the trajectory of everything that I do. And the reason was that it was a really transformative, magical moment, because here I was sitting in my car listening to voices coming out of my earphones, but I was being transported to all these lives of American people whom I would never otherwise encounter or meet, and who were sharing intimate stories of their lives. And it was sort of dizzying and exciting. So one moment I was on a farm in Iowa, and the next moment I was in a boardroom of, with billion-dollar deals being made on Wall Street. And then I was in Plano, Texas with illegal Salvadorian immigrant families. And it was just so amazingly interesting. And all I could think as I was taking this in and listening to this was how wonderful would it be if we could replicate something like this in Israel? And the reason I was so excited about this was because I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity of recently listening to what a normal Israeli radio broadcast sounds like. But in case you haven't, I brought you a little clip of sort of an average 20 seconds of Israeli radio. So hopefully you'll be able to hear this. Let's check.
לא ענית על שאלה אחת, ינון מגל, תודה רבה לך. כן, לא, אתה.
מה ההבדל בינך לבין היטלר, כלב אדום שכמוך?
אז תלך קיבינימט לארצות הברית, אתה והחברים שלך, פשטינקן דרג גיי קיבינימטי, תעביר אותו מפה, לך לעזאזל.
So even if you don't, so from looking at your smiles, I can tell that you did hear that. Yes, can you just nod and yeah, okay, so you did hear that. So even if you don't speak Hebrew, you can imagine that that doesn't quite sound like your average NPR station. And indeed, Israeli radio, Israelis listen to a ton of radio. It has a huge radio share, primarily because we're stuck in traffic so often, which I'm sure is something you can identify with. But Israeli radio really doesn't have the kind of carefully produced human interest stories that we have come to love and expect from public radio in the States. And instead, as you could hear, it's often these aggressive interviewers with an open mic yelling at a rotating cast of 200 or 300 public intellectuals and politicians and celebrities. And it's all very aggressive. It's always kind of a shouting match, who can yell louder. And what we wanted to do was something completely different. So we were extremely energized by this idea. And I came back to Israel at the end of my road trip. I got 3 of my childhood friends. We had all together. We had all grown up together in Noam, which is a small youth group of the conservative movement, of the Masorti movement in Israel. And the fact that the 4 of us had this gathering in my living room to discuss my idea represented a reunion of about 70% of the youth group. It was a really tiny youth group. But I said to them, listen, I just encountered this amazingly exciting new medium. Why don't we listen together to an episode and tell me if you're as excited about this as I am? And if so, perhaps we can think of doing, an Israeli version of This American Life. So we all listened, and thankfully they were all as excited as I had been. And we decided, okay, we were going to go for it. And there was only one small problem, and that small problem was that we had no idea what to do. I mean, none of us had any experience in media or radio or journalism. We were all doing other things. I just started this PhD at the Hebrew University. Another one was a neuroscientist. Another one was working with delinquent youth in South Tel Aviv. A 4th one was a clinical psychologist. So we really didn't know much, but we had a lot of team spirit and a lot of goodwill. And we reached out to the folks at This American Life and sort of sheepishly said that we wanted to be this sort of Israeli copycat. And this is a little clip of me talking to the host of This American Life, Ira Glass, about that very first time that we met.
Hey, Mishy.
Yeah, hi.
Hi. Okay, it seems like we're recording and everything's going beautifully over here.
So, Ira, how did you feel when you heard that there was this Israeli copycat?
I felt fine about it, actually. I felt flattered.
I don't know if you remember this, but the first time we met, I came into your office and I was kind of starstruck and really excited. And I walked into your office and do you remember what happened?
I totally remember. I said to you, like, oh, are you the Israelis who are ripping off our show? I had heard about you.
And is that how you felt, that we were the Israelis that were ripping off your show?
Well, it isn't a question of how I feel. That's just a statement of fact. You are the Israelis who are ripping off our show.
So with that blessing, we set off to work. We worked for an entire year on our very first episode, because we had to teach ourselves essentially everything: how to record, how to edit, how to write for radio, who our target audience was going to be. And we went to New York and sort of observed This American Life's process for a while to see how they worked on their episodes. And then with a lot of trepidation and a lot of excitement, we released our very first episode. This was in 2012. Now, the reason that we were doing all of this was in part because it was a cool and creative project that we were all excited about. But there was a deeper reason, and the deeper reason was that Israel, as I'm sure many of you know, is a very complicated and very compartmentalized society. So take Jerusalem, my city where I grew up. Jerusalem has about 900,000 residents. About a third of them are ultra-Orthodox Jews, Haredim, and about a third of them are Arabs, primarily in East Jerusalem. And the truth of the matter is that growing up, I barely had any interactions with Haredim or with Arabs. In fact, I don't have any Haredi or Arab friends. And even though, I live in a city in which the demographics are, as I just discussed. And furthermore, my experience isn't particularly unique. I think that it is the experience of most Israelis that they surround themselves with people who are in many ways very similar to them, either in terms of their politics or their education or their socioeconomic status. And neighborhoods are, often quite homogenous. And this isn't even, obviously, to state the obvious, this isn't necessarily an Israeli phenomenon. I mean, people around the world surround themselves with people who are like them in many different ways. But what is perhaps unique to Israel is that because Israel is physically so small, it's impossible to completely avoid interacting with, the other. So what happens is you see members of other groups, and it's of course not only Arabs or Haredim, there's Ethiopian immigrants and Eritrean and Sudanese refugees and Filipino foreign workers and Russians and Ashkenazim and Mizrahim and so on and so forth. So what often happens is you'll see somebody from a different group walking on the street or shopping next to you in the supermarket or in the shuk or online in the hospital or at the doctor's office or whatever. And you'll immediately take in what he or she has or doesn't have on their head, what clothes they're wearing, what color skin they have, and then sort of put a label on them and put them in a box. And because we know, or at least we think we know a lot about what constitutes being part of any given social group, we start piling up all these assumptions onto them. So we say, well, okay, he's an ultra-Orthodox Jew, so we know what that means in terms of all kinds of different aspects of life. We know what his dinner table looks like, and what newspapers he reads, and which parties he votes for, and what he thinks about the gay pride parade in Jerusalem, and how many kids he has, and on and on and on and on. And in fact, we pile up so many assumptions that by the time we're done, within that split second, we've almost obviated the necessity of exchanging any words at all, because we think that we know so much about that other person. And if I've learned one thing on from working on Israel Story for the last now 9 years, it's how rarely people actually conform to these labels that we apply to them. But we thought, going back to the reason of why we embarked on this project, we thought that perhaps by eliminating the visual, as one does when one creates a podcast or a radio show, we would be able to play a little trick on our listeners. And we would allow them to suspend their judgment just a little bit longer. So maybe 30 seconds longer, 60 seconds longer, or 90 seconds longer. And yes, it's true that there's accents and there's idioms and so on and so forth. But when you just listen to a voice and you don't have that visual input, it's much, much harder to sort of label or catalog people into various different groups. And we thought that perhaps if we are able to allow people that gift of suspending their judgment for just a little bit, people will be open-minded to listening to a story that they might otherwise not be able to hear, that they might not be open to hear. So as I said, after a year of work, we released our very first episode in a somewhat unceremonious way. We had exactly 0 fans and followers. We were 4 friends. We each had a girlfriend and 2 parents. So we said to ourselves that if we could get all 12 of those people to listen to our first episode, that would be a tremendous success. And we ended up getting 11 out of the 12. One of the dads bailed on us, unfortunately. But we were extremely excited and decided to release another episode and another episode after that. And we would put these things on Facebook, and basically no one would listen, and it was completely under the radar. And then a minor miracle happened. I happened to be at some event in which I saw across the room the commander of Galei Tzahal. Galei Tzahal is the IDF radio, which is one of 2 national radio stations in Israel. Israel only has 2 national talk radio stations. One belongs to the government, the other one belongs to the army. Sounds perhaps a little bit more like North Korea than Israel, but it is the truth. I saw the commander, the head of the army radio station at the other side of the room. And as it happened, he was just about to put a little pastry, a little pig in the blanket into his mouth. So I figured that I had about 20 seconds of airtime as he was digesting this pig in the blanket. So I could sort of come up to him and uninterrupted give my elevator pitch. And I went up to him and I said, "Hello, Yaron, you don't know me. My name is Mishy Harman, and I have just created a podcast, and I would love it if perhaps you would want to listen to it." And I think he was so startled between trying not to suffocate on his pig in the blanket and also just by the sort of how quickly everything happened, that he said, "Sure. Why don't you give a CD, burn a CD and give it to my secretary?" And I think the primary thing that was going on there, in my favor, was that he wasn't familiar, I think, with the word podcast. So I think he didn't even know what I was even talking about. So I said to him, well, Yaron, with great pleasure, but it's already 2012, so people don't really burn CDs anymore. I can, send you a link, given that it's already an electronic thing. And he said, no, it's much easier. Just burn a CD for me. So then I had to walk around all of Jerusalem looking for a store that still could burn CDs. And then I delivered it to his secretary, and it went down the food chain in Galei Tzahal. And then I guess someone liked it enough to put it back up the food chain. And one day I got a phone call informing me that they were giving us a slot for 4 consecutive nights during Hanukkah on national radio to air our episodes. And luckily at this point we had exactly 4 episodes. So it all worked out very, very well. And we aired these 4 episodes in Hanukkah of 2012. And we had, for us, it was a dream come true, because suddenly like this little podcast that we had sort of dreamt up in our living rooms was a national radio. But we had no idea and no expectations. This was all a late night hobby, of course, for us. And then something really miraculous happened. They aired these 4 episodes, and thousands of people started writing in to Galei Tzahal, to the radio station, saying basically versions of the same thing, which was, my name is Yossi, I'm 65 years old, I live in Afula, and last night listening to the radio was the very first time in my life that I actually took, Hanukkah miracle indeed, actually took the time to listen, to actually listen to the story of an ultra-Orthodox woman from Tzfat, or a Bedouin teenager from Chura, or a Russian immigrant who works as a night guard at a parking lot, or whatever it was. And to us, this was this huge validation of what it is that we tried to do, which was to allow people the space to actually interact with other Israelis that they wouldn't otherwise meet. So we were very happy by this, and thankfully, so were the radio station, who then shortly thereafter told us that there's this Israeli singer who's sort of like the Israeli version of Celine Dion or something, like a sort of cheesy pop singer called Shlomo Artzi, and he had a weekly radio talk show in the best slot of the week, which is Friday afternoons, just as everyone is preparing for Shabbat and cooking and cleaning. And he was going to Greece for the summer, so his slot was open. So they offered us his slot to do a full season worth of 11 episodes of Sipur Israeli, of Israel Story. And we were delighted, and we set out to work, and we released this first season, and it was a wild success. And mainly, I mean, it was so heartening that so many people were reaching out to us, and that it seemed as if it was really touching people. We aired a story about an ultra-Orthodox woman who was a serial adopter of babies with Down syndrome. And then we heard from something like 30 people, 30 listeners who told us that as a result of hearing our show, they decided to adopt a baby with special needs. And this was mind-blowing for us. I mean, we couldn't imagine that there was an actual real-world impact to these stories that we were telling on the radio. And then we sort of reached this junction where we had to decide what to do. Because as I said, up until then, this was a late night hobby, something that we did between like midnight and 4 a.m. And there was no budget whatsoever. And it was all kind of a passion project. And we decided that if we wanted to make this into something that continued, we would need to try to raise some money for this and make this into a job or a part-time job for some of us. And we reached out to many, many different foundations. I wrote something like 1,000 letters to various different foundations and heard back from almost none of them. And the very, very few that did reply said basically the same thing, which was, this sounds like it's an exciting project and sounds like it's a worthy cause, but as it's in Hebrew, we're really not going to support or fund anything that we can't understand. And that was the very first time that we had the somewhat counterintuitive idea of creating an English language version of this. And it was counterintuitive because we were effectively now creating the American version of the Israeli version of This American Life. And we were also jumping into a whole new playing field, because in Israel, we were essentially the only podcast. We were the first real big podcast. And as such, almost everything we did was novel and well received. And here we were suddenly jumping into this was before Serial had 100 million listeners across America, but still podcasts were a thing already in the States. And we knew that in order to attract listeners, we would have to really create and produce at that kind of high level of production. And we very luckily partnered with Tablet Magazine, which I'm sure some of you are aware of and know, is an online Jewish magazine based in New York. And to our amazement and surprise, Steven Spielberg decided that he was a fan of this idea. So they gave us our first grant to go out and create an English language version of the show. Now, there was, of course, a funding impetus here, but on a much, much deeper level, the reason that we created Israel Story in English was because we had all spent significant amounts of time in the US. And we had all encountered something which I'm sure each and every one of you have encountered many, many times in your life. And that was that Israel is often portrayed, especially in America, but really around the world, in a very, very flat, unidimensional narrative. And there's several different narratives like that. So there's one narrative, which is a political narrative, in which Israel is really all about Bibi Netanyahu and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and terror and Security Council resolutions and Iranian nuclear threats and the occupation and so on and so forth. The second one was a religious narrative. Israel's a homeland for the Jews. All the food is in the supermarket is kosher. You can, take a bus to the Kotel and so on and so forth. And then there's also an Israel advocacy narrative, in which Israel is a startup nation and a Middle Eastern Silicon Valley, and there are all these Israeli companies on the NASDAQ and Waze and so on, and cherry tomatoes, and And we felt that none of these flat narratives really captured our Israel, the Israel that we love and grew up in, and which is our home. And that Israel is a complicated Israel. It's a real place. It's not just a unidimensional place. It's a place which has an unbelievably rich human tapestry, and is in many ways wonderful and beautiful, and in other ways ugly and terrible. And above all, is just a real living place. And we thought that if we are able to illuminate or to shine a spotlight on that Israel, on these human interest stories, then perhaps we can attract people who are otherwise not engaged in conversation about Israel. And as I was sort of formulating that in my mind at the time, I was constantly thinking of one of my college roommates, Jesse, who is sort of Jewish. His father is Jewish, his mother is not. He identifies, I imagine, as a Jew, sort of in nominal terms, but other than having a bar mitzvah, 25 years ago or something like that, he basically has no real Jewish presence in his life. He's a progressive, liberal filmmaker. He lives in LA, and unlike his grandfather, who had a tzedakah box in his on his mantle and would put a nickel or a dime to plant trees in Israel every Friday or something like that, or even his father, who grew up and as a teenager had the experience of the 6-Day War and the euphoria around that, and went to volunteer on a kibbutz. For Jesse, Israel is really New York Times headlines. And it's very hard for Jesse, and Jesse represents a wide and expansive group of people, in my experience, to reconcile any interest in, engagement with, I'm not even talking about support for Israel, with his otherwise progressive politics. And we thought that if we were able to tell good human interest stories that would be interesting no matter if they came from Israel or from Iceland or from Venezuela, we would be able to wrap the Jessies of the world into a conversation about Israel without them even realizing that it was a conversation about Israel. As far as they were concerned, it was just good human interest content and stories. So with that, we set off and we started creating these episodes in English. And luckily, they were a big success. And I'm now skipping to the present. And we, on Tuesday, are about to, a week from today, are about to start our 5th season in English. We just also finished our yet another Hebrew season. And we now, as Amy very generously said, have many, many listeners all around the world in 194 countries. We know a lot about our listeners, so I occasionally get to chat with listeners in places like Iran and Chad and Yemen and Saudi Arabia and Brazil and all over the place. And we have luckily been able to tell many, many different kinds of stories about Israel that I think defy people's expectations and allow them to connect to Israel on a non-political level, which was our goal all along. So now I just want to use about the next maybe 13, 14 minutes to give you a little taste of this, and then we can open it up to some questions if you have any. So we've been at this, as I said, now for quite a while, for 9 years all in all. And what's perhaps most meaningful to me is that this project has allowed me to step out of my own little bubble that I was describing beforehand, and actually get to know Israel, real Israel, or at least versions of the real Israel. And one of the challenges of doing that was, we selected as the name for our show Israel Story. So it's not the Israel story. It's not that authoritative, of course. But we selected Israel Story, and when you call a show Israel Story, it immediately begs the question of what is Israel's story, and how do you tell it, and how do you find it? Who do you talk to? Now, I mentioned that when we just started, today there's a large team working on the show. There's about 15 producers in addition to sound engineers and designers and musicians and so on and so forth. And we've added all kinds of other levels of the operation. We do live shows all over the world. We've done more than 200 performances over the years in more than 50 cities across North America. But when we were just starting, it was just me and my 3 childhood friends, Ro'i, Shai, and Yochai, who had all grown up together with me in that youth movement. And this was at once both a tremendous gift to be able to start a project like this with your closest childhood friends, but also posed a serious challenge. And that serious challenge was that here we were promising our listeners that we were going to tell them Israel's story, but in fact, we couldn't have been more homogenous as a group of creators if we tried. We were essentially carbon copies of each other. We had all grown up together. We were all born in 1983. We were all boys. We all had one Israeli parent and one American parent. We were all very involved in the academic world and so on and so forth. And it was a real problem for us because really we represented a tiny, tiny, tiny little segment of the Israeli experience. And indeed, early on, when we started searching for stories, many of our stories came just from within our families because that's what we had access to and that's what we knew. So here's a little snippet of a story that we ran with my dad early on. My dad's father, my grandfather, was for many years Israel's ambassador in the United States in the 1950s and 60s. And in 1962, my father turned 18 years old. And he needed to come back, even though his parents were still living in Washington, he needed to come back to Israel to go into the army. So he and his father came back to Jerusalem to go searching for an apartment in which he would live as a lone soldier, meaning a soldier whose parents live abroad. So this is a little snippet from that story.
And as we were walking, a car, a pretty fancy car by the standards of those days, stopped. And the window rolled down, and an elderly lady poked out her head and said, "Abe and David, what are you doing here?"
The elderly lady in question?
It was Golda Meir, who was then the foreign minister, my father's boss, and an old-time family friend.
Jerusalem was a small town in those days. A place where it made sense that you'd bump into the foreign minister and start chit-chatting. In any event, they told Golda they were looking for a room for my dad, who was about to go into the army.
And she immediately said, "Stop looking. I live in a house a block and a half away from here, which is all empty, and it'd be a pleasure if you just came and took a room there." And 2 days later, I moved in.
What did you think when she said, "Come live with me"?
I was delighted. It was a good address, great location, low rent.
So Golda was your first roommate?
She was not my roommate. We were housemates. I was her boarder.
So we told many stories of our families, and you can hear them on the show. And once we had essentially exhausted stories of our families, we widened the circle a little bit to tell stories of our friends. So this is a clip of a story that we did about my friend Elik Frumchenko, who is married to my sort of long-term high school girlfriend, although we're all friends, don't worry. We all love each other, but this is Elik.
Okay, so I'm Elik Frumchenko. In my profession, I'm a marketing manager. I work for an auto magazine. That's what I do in my real life.
But the truth is, much like Clark Kent and Superman, Elik also has a secret identity.
Yeah, I'm also a professional whistler.
Now, if you're like me, or just plain normal, maybe you don't know what it means to be a professional whistler. I mean, a lot of people whistle. In the shower, on the street. But it turns out that professional whistlers have an area of expertise.
Okay, so first of all, I can do all kinds of cool effects. Like, for example, I can imitate a cell phone. And I can do also a vibrating cell phone.
So that story was how Elik unexpectedly won an international whistling competition in Hebei province in China. and while he was backpacking in China after on his post-army trip. So we told stories of people like Elik. We told stories of another close high school friend of mine called Ariel. In Jerusalem, I don't know if any of you have visited this illustrious institution, but there's a restaurant called Pinati, which is a sort of legendary hummus place in the center of town. And Pinati has been there forever, essentially. And Ariel claims that he invented the pitcher, like a pitcher of juice or of beer or something. So Ariel claims that he invented the pitcher at Pinati. Here he is.
Many people who know me, at some point will hear this story. This is part of who I am.
And he's very proud of it.
I invented a concept.
You realize that, pitcher is something that exists in many, many places around the world.
What I invented was not a picture. I invented the option to change something in Pinati, the open-mindedness to change. I brought change to Pinati.
For years, he's been telling us that he regards this as the pinnacle of his creative life.
This is definitely one of the most important and greatest achievements of my life. I don't know if that means I haven't achieved much or this is just really important.
So, Ariel, Pinati is one of those establishments where they have on the walls, they have pictures of all kinds of B and C celebrities that have eaten there. And it's like a real badge of honor in as a Jerusalemite to get your picture on the wall in Pinati. And it's usually, sort of third-rate politicians and soccer players and stuff like that. But Ariel, ever since I've known him, which has been now for about 20 years, has been waging an aggressive campaign, or even a war, I would say, to get his picture on the wall at Pinati as the inventor or the father of the pitcher. So here he is.
For him, more than anything, it was a matter of recording his accomplishment for posterity.
I need to have a picture on the wall with my picture to prove for the rest of history that I invented the picture. And this is why this story is so important, because I don't have children. This is the closest I have to children, is to have a picture in Pinati.
And you might think that he is saying that in jest, but in fact he is completely serious. And you can listen to the story in which we document his campaign to get his picture on the wall in Pinati. So we moved from telling stories of our family to telling stories of our friends, but there was one small problem, which was that since the four of us were all friends ourselves, our friends happened to be the same people. So it wasn't really, didn't really broaden the circles that much. So we were in a real problem here. Here we were telling these stories, in a podcast called Israel Story, but in fact they were telling a story of a very, very narrow existence or narrow sliver of the population. So what we started to do is to try to go out into our neighborhoods and record people in our neighborhoods. And I, at the time, lived at the edge of an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood in Jerusalem. And I was one of the only non-ultra-Orthodox people living on my street. And I had a very, very nice neighbor who was an elderly woman who I would say hi to, and we would talk from time to time, and I would help her up with her groceries and stuff like that. And then one day I walked in to help her with some groceries, and she started telling me some story. I asked some question about a picture on the wall or something, and she started telling me a story. And I asked her if I could stop and run home a second and bring my my recording equipment. And the story was about how this woman used to be a Chabad rabbi in the old city. And here is a clip of her telling me the story of how, of the last Shabbat meal that then he, as a rabbi, and his wife at the time hosted in the old city.
I remember walking up on Rehov HaKinor, which goes uphill, and almost stopping. I had like 20 people behind me. I said, God, I can't do this anymore. This is it. You've got to help me. I'm begging you. I'm begging you. It was probably one of my most real prayers in my life. I just begged God to please rescue me from this. And when everyone was leaving, everyone was saying what everyone usually would say when they left. Oh, what a beautiful family, what a beautiful Shabbat, what delicious food. And each time I would get these compliments, it would be like another dagger, another dagger, another dagger. And this one man came up to me and he said, "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Alone. And I thought he was going to really lay it on, like, "Oh, you've just changed my life." Because I used to get that. So we went to another part of the house that was more private, and he said, "I'm going to tell you something, and please hear me. Please hear me. That was an amazing act you performed for us tonight. Take care of yourself. Whatever is wrong, take care of you." I told my prior wife exactly what he said. I said, "It's over. This is it. God answered my prayer." I slept that night for the first time like I hadn't slept in years.
And you can hear the entire story of how Yaakov became Jeff. He left religion, became a gay man, and then transitioned to being a woman, Jessica, and then transitioned back to being an Orthodox woman, Yiska, on our show. And Yiska is a dear friend and a really admirable woman, and I hope you listen to her story. So we started talking to neighbors, and once we had sort of exhausted our neighborhood stories, we started reading all kinds of local news stories and blogs and small kind of little local newspaper stories. And in one of them, I happened to follow high school basketball in Israel. And there was an interview with the captain of the girls team that had just won some sort of regional competition in basketball. And the captain of this girl team was mainly talking about basketball, but then she had this very cute little sentence that she said about her grandparents' first kiss. And it seemed so cute to me that I sought her out, and we went to interview her grandparents, and here they are, Tzvi and Regina.
Their first kiss was memorable, but not at all in the way first kisses usually are.
So one day I lost my, how you say it?
Inhibitions.
Control. Yeah. And I went to him and gave him a kiss here.
I think that it was very sudden and very surprising that we came so close to each other.
And suddenly he fell down on the floor.
Tzvi fainted.
Yeah, he was so excited. And I looked and I was afraid what happened, and helped him to come up from the floor. He will tell you later.
I never had a close relation to a girl. Look, I was nearly 18, but I have lost my best years in the camps and in the ghetto.
And you can hear in Tzvi and Regina's story on our show as well. So moving on from there, we started reading blogs and we started thinking of ways that we could really go out of our comfort zone. We came up with these ideas for concept episodes. So one of the early ones was that we chose an address. I'm just going to steal 2 more minutes to play a couple more clips, if you don't mind. So we came up with a concept of going to an address. So Herzl Street is the most common street name in all of Israel. And we decided to visit every single 48 Herzl Street. We decided on 48 because of 1948, of course, being a symbolic address, 48 Herzl Street. And we went on and knocked on every single 48 Herzl Street in Israel. There are 39 of them. And we told the stories of the people who happen to work or live there. And when you go on a project, when you embark on a project like that, you kind of get a cross section of Israeliness, because you get rich people and poor people, and young people and old people, and Sfaradim and Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, and religious and Jews and Arabs and secular and Russians and so on and so forth. So that was a great project that we did. We spent 24 hours straight in an all-night diner on the coastal road and spoke to everyone who walked through the door. And slowly, we started to get pitches from people. as our audience grew, people would suggest more and more stories to us. And one day we got a pitch from a 40-year-old Palestinian hipster from Brooklyn, who told us that he had this crazy experience in Israel, which all started when he was walking on the street with his dying father. Here he is.
And he turns to me as we're waiting for this light to change, and he turns, he goes, you know, I want to see your children before I die. That statement right there propelled me to do things that I'd never thought I would do. So I did something very impulsive. I had a conversation with my mom, which I never thought I would have with her, but I was like, look, I want to compromise with you guys. I want a woman who is more on the modern side of things. We're Jordanian, Palestinian. I think Queen Rania of Jordan is amazingly beautiful. If I can find someone like Queen Rania of Jordan, I would be so happy. And so my mom's exact words, Queen Rania, yeah, her family's from Tulkarm, where our relatives live. I'll tell you what, in Tulkarm, it's like going to a lemon tree. You could pick all the Queen Ranias you want. You could just pluck them out. And she did this thing with her hands where she mimed plucking a Queen Rania off a tree. And I'm like visualizing like beautiful women hanging like Queen Rania on a tree that I would just pluck out when I got there. So I book a ticket.
But it will perhaps come as no surprise to you that this plan went awry and didn't go as well as Ghazi had planned, and you can listen to the whole story, but the bottom line is that there is now a fatwa issued against him from ever again entering Tulkarm. So we received many, many pitches, and ultimately what happens is that you start developing these story antennae, and you start experiencing the world in such a way that you sort of notice stories everywhere. And the last clip that I'm gonna play, and then we'll just open up for a few minutes of questions, hopefully, demonstrates that. And during my PhD, as I was about to finish my PhD, I got a scholarship to go live in Madison, Wisconsin for a year, just to write the dissertation. And on the weekends, I would take Nomi, the same Nomi from that road trip at the beginning of the story, out to the country, and I would ride my bike and she would run and so on and so forth. And one day we came to a place called Plain, Wisconsin, which has a population of 770 people. It's in dairy land. There are all these silos and farms. And I suddenly, on one of the farms, I saw a Magen David, a Star of David made out of 2x4s. And I thought to myself, that's unusual. Perhaps if someone was trying to make a star and like it didn't exactly go according to plan. But I knocked on the door, and that is how I met Dubi Ayalon, a retired high-ranking officer in the IDF who had a midlife crisis and left Israel and moved to the middle of nowhere in Wisconsin to become a buffalo farmer. And I don't know if you know, but buffaloes are not domesticated like cows. So they don't sort of eagerly come into the barn to be milked. You have to coax them into coming into the barn. And Dubi does this by singing a song to them. And he sings a song which has to do with the day that he received them. He received them on a Jewish holiday, so he chose a song that relates to that holiday in order to teach them to come into the barn. And here he is, Dubi Ayalon.
Avinu Malekenu.
My name is Dubi.
Choneinu Aneinu.
I am now 61. Fuck, I'm old. 61.
Avinu Malkeinu. Choneinu Aneinu.
I came from the Holy Land right into the holy shit.
Ki en banu maasim.
I live in the middle of nowhere, somewhere in Wisconsin, and I'm the first Israeli redneck living in the US.
Aseima nu tzedakah v'chesed ve'hoshienu.
So that is a little taste of Dubi, and that's a little taste of the kind of voices that you hear on the show. And I'll just end by saying that we live in a time, obviously, in which it's hard to talk about Israel, and in which polemicists on all sides seem to think that yelling and shouting is as good a way as any to get people to listen to you, and that taking sides loudly and fervently and as often as possible is almost an act of responsibility, a duty. And we believe something different. We think that the way to get people involved and interested and engaged is through highlighting Israel's stories and its people and its many, many truths and realities. So thank you all very, very much. Hopefully you enjoyed hearing some of these clips. And if you have any questions at all, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you so much, Mishy. I have a question while we let others post in the chat. Do you have a favorite episode?
Well, we've now released, in 4 seasons, we've released 50 episodes in English and something like 45 episodes in Hebrew, and are just about to embark, as I said, on our next season, which has 15 new episodes. So, and all of them are extremely, extremely dear to my heart. So I usually say no. Of course, there are stories that I feel have influenced me more and are sort of more important to me, and have many of the people have become friends of mine in my life, and so on and so forth. But I sent Ari some of our most popular episodes, which Ari, I think, is going to be able to send out to you, so you can sample that. And perhaps this is a good opportunity to say that all of you already have Israel Story on your phones. So all you have to do is go to your phone, to your podcast application. If you have an iPhone, it's built in. You already have one. It's called Podcasts, and you just search for Israel Story. If you have an Android, there are many, many podcast applications. Just download any one of them and search for Israel Story. And if you're not so great with smartphones or with downloading things, just go to our website. It's israelstory.org, and there you can listen to all of our episodes.
Amazing. Another question. Well, 2 things. I noticed Ari has had Yitzka Smith here at CSP at least once.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
And then was there an episode that was the most controversial that you've gotten, letters about and stuff like that?
It's very interesting because Israel is a polarizing and controversial topic for many, many people. And we often do live shows or presentations on college campuses where just, a week earlier, some
Oops, sorry, that was an accident. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no. So we often come to college campuses where just a week earlier, some Israeli diplomat or official was booed off the stage or whatever, and we hardly ever encounter any real resistance or objection, because at the end of the day, what we're doing was we're telling human interest stories. It's just stories of people's lives, and it's very difficult to argue with that. Of course, as we grow and now our audience has really become very international and very large, some people, take issue with certain stories. So like last year, we aired an episode about Messianic Jews in Jerusalem, 2 brothers, 2 formerly Orthodox Jewish brothers from Brooklyn, or from the Bronx actually, who became Messianic Jews and are now leaders of the Messianic Jewish congregation in Jerusalem. And a bunch of people said to us, how dare you give them a platform? They're, proselytizers and missionaries and stuff. And we said, that they're part of these rich human fabric of Jerusalem and of Israel. And as such, their stories are worth telling and are interesting. And you might not agree with them and might think differently about life, but they are also part of society. So that's sort of something in recent memory that some people took issue with.
I see a question from Martin Brower here in the chat. It says, do you charge for the podcast or how do you get paid? How do you make money?
So no, the podcast is entirely free. All of you can listen. Podcasts in general have emerged as a free medium. How we pay for this is a much more complicated answer. It's the truth of the matter is it's very difficult. Each episode like this costs a lot of money to produce. There's a large team. We write original music for all of our episodes. And it takes us months and months and months to work on each episode. We do it through a combination. We fund this through a combination of the generosity of foundations and listeners and donors, and also all kinds of revenue streams that we've dreamt up over the years. So we, about 5 years ago, started doing live shows, as I mentioned, which are sort of staged adaptations of episodes with, it's sort of like an off-Broadway production. So it's like with dancers and a live band and musicians and video and live animation and all kinds of things going on the stage. And we tour twice a year with that. We've already done, as I said, 10 different shows. Each one had multiple tours, and each tour has many performances. We give presentations and talks and workshops. And of course, there are also sponsors for the episodes. So actually, Ari mentioned beforehand that Selwyn Gerber is here, and they were sponsors of an entire season of Israel's story. So it's always an uphill battle, but thank God we're still in the game and doing the best we can.
How large would you say your audience is these days?
So the audience is quite large. There are about 150,000 people who listen to Israel's Story regularly. And then many of our stories also get picked up by other shows or by NPR stations or by CBC in Canada or ABC in Australia, which brings them to millions and millions of people. So it's quite a large audience at this point.
I see a couple questions that have been sent here to me. Sebastian Guzman asks, are you planning a US tour anytime soon? Another one?
Yeah, yes. So we were supposed to come we usually come for Yom Ha'atzmaut and in May and tour. And there was a tour planned for May last month, but of course that was canceled like everything else in the world. But instead we actually did something cool. We put on a program called Israelpalooza, which was a 12-hour long Zoom broadcast on Yom Ha'atzmaut, on Israel's Independence Day, in which we had these intimate interviews and workshops and live concerts and cooking classes. So we talked to people like Isaac Perlman and Joan Nathan and Moshe Safdie, the architect, and Amari Stoudemire, the NBA star, and David Broza gave a concert, and you can see all of that. Perhaps Ari can send out a link. We're uploading the individual parts of Israelpalooza to YouTube, so you can see that as well. We also have active Facebook community where we do a lot of live events as well. So we're trying as best we can during COVID to adjust. And in fact, we're starting our season with a COVID mini-series called Alone Together, which is all about Corona days in Israel.
Cool. Are you still, so does Tablet Magazine still produce the show?
Yes, so Tablet are sort of like our home station, essentially. They are our partners in this, and all of our episodes are available through Tablet, and they are definitely a big part of the success of this show.
Have you done any collaborations with Mark Oppenheimer and Stephanie Butnick and Leo Leibowitz from Unorthodox?
Yes, we've done many things with them. We love our friends from Unorthodox, and they've done a lot of stuff about us. They've aired our show. We've aired some of their material, and we're very much intertwined.
I see a comment from Jeff and Debbie Podless that says that your podcasts have kept them company on many long road trips between Orange County and San Francisco.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you, Jeff and Debbie.
They also ask, with your PhDs and other educational experience, it sounds like this is your full-time job, or are you multitasking other things as well?
So no, this is now what I do. I mean, as I said, we now have run a team of about 15 people who produce the show. Still are sort of on the periphery of the academic world, but have decided to go down this path.
Jonathan Fine asks, we can find this out and send it out. Maybe Ari can email everyone. What number episode was the story of the buffalo farmer in Wisconsin?
Oh, that's a good question. It was one of our early episodes. It's an episode that's called Holy Cow. And it's stories of bovines. But I don't remember offhand what number it was, but I'm sure if you just look at the list of episodes, I'm sure you can find it.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for this. It was so nice to hear your story, and I'm so excited to listen to more of the episodes of Israel's story. And so thanks everyone for being with us.
I hope that people listen and tune in, and if you have any questions, more than happy to answer them offline. And I hope you discover our content, and through that the world of podcasts, and mainly hope that all of you stay safe and well.
Excellent. I see that Jake Jacobs and Ari both just posted links to the Holy Cow episode.
Okay.
So and we can email that out as well. So thanks again everyone for joining us. Check us out on Thursday with Toby Khan, and back on Sunday with Rafi Zarum, and lots of other things coming up. So hope to see you all there, and it's good to see everybody.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Have a great day. Thank you, Mishy.